Welcome everyone to our discussion forum based on our Delta Think News and Views series. For the regulars, welcome back. We're happy to see you again. And for anyone out there who's a newbie, we're thrilled to have you join us today for the first time. And we hope that we will see you again in the future. First, I'm going to start off with some quick introductions. I'm Heather Staines, a senior consultant here at Delta Think and director of community engagement for the Open Access Data and Analytics tool. With me is my colleague and News and Views author, Dan Pollack. Dan's our Chief Digital Officer at Delta Think and one of the architects of the Delta Think Open Access Data and Analytics tool. Now, if you've joined us for a News and Views forum before, you know a little bit about how we hope these will go. They're designed to be really interactive, give you the opportunity to ask questions and have us really engage in a lively discussion. Few logistical items before we begin. When you have a question, it will be really helpful for us if you do put it into the Q&A box rather than in the chat. That gives me one place and Deanna one place where we can kind of keep an eye out there. We're going to start off with some opening remarks. Then Dan and I have some questions that we've been dying to ask each other. And then we'll open that up to bring in your questions as well. Now, we've scheduled an hour for today, but that's completely up to you. If you have a lot of questions, we may go closer to that. If everyone is totally satisfied with the presentation we give and needing to move along, we may end a little bit before the hour. So thank you again for joining us. And I'm going to stop sharing and then hand over to Dan for some headlines.
Thanks, Heather. Hello, everyone. Welcome. So what we want to look at today is market sizing. As some of you may be aware, every year Delta Think tries to estimate the size of the scholarly journals open access market. We need to wait for the summer for some of the big data sources to update, and then we crunch the numbers. So here we are with some headlines. We're looking at the monetizable subset of everything that's published, so trying to focus on how the money might flow. So that is, if you are selling stuff, you're a publisher, that's revenue coming in. If you are buying stuff, that means you are a librarian or researcher or whatever, buying either subscription or publication fees, then the market size is your cost. So but either way, it's all about money. And so let's kick off with the headlines. In 2020, we estimated the open access journals market to be $975 million US. And just so you understand definitions, by open access, we're talking about articles that are made free to read and free to reuse, as opposed to, say, public access. So we're talking about open access market, $975 million US. And we think that represents a change of 25% over the year before, over 2019. Just to put that in context, we think that the growth from 2018 to 19, so last year's growth, was significantly less, probably around 16 or so percent. So really big growth number. And then in terms of just the volume of stuff produced, we think that open access output, free to read and reuse, now accounts for around about 36% of all output. And if things continue on trend, and we'll come back to discussing what some of the trends might look like, but if things continue, we think maybe by around about 2024, sort of through 2024-ish, open access output will account for about 50%, half of all output. The proportion of revenue is a lot less than the proportion of output. So open access revenue accounts for just under 9% of total journals publication revenue. And at the current growth rates, we think it will take until about 2039 before open access revenue gets past that halfway point compared with the 2024 for the open access output. So those are our headlines. I suppose the other big thing, as we alluded to kind of this time last year and in some of our monthly pieces, is there has been a big spike in publication activity in the wake of COVID. So I'm going to throw that out there because I think that gets us into our discussion. And really, having run through the numbers and thought about them, that 25% growth, the first thing I thought was, that's a big number. And really, Heather, over to you. This is where I like to open up our discussion of what you think about that. Do you think it's big? What do you think some of the drivers might be?
Yeah, it's been really interesting since you came out, with some of those numbers to kind of sense check them and try to put them in a broader context. I mean, we hope that COVID is an exceptional event, right? I was speaking, with some folks the other day, and they said they wanted to know sort of when it's going to be over. And I'm a historian by training, and I think it may well be that we will not be able to identify generally in society when it's over. Future historians may go back and sort of put a pin in that. But in talking about to folks across the industry, as you have, I've also been hearing about that huge number of submissions. This time last year, publishers were talking about how they increased the size of some issues. They've done special issues. They were pulling out every card possible to try to accommodate, particularly in the life sciences and the medical field, that increase. Researchers, in many cases, as we know, were displaced from their labs. Experiments, in many cases, were left behind. But that did give teams the opportunity to look at their backlog and look at experiments and data that they had previously collected and start to maybe work through some of that. You've probably also heard that there is some indication that maybe women are able to devote less time to their backlog than perhaps men have been. I think peer review is definitely under pressure to accommodate that large increase in submissions, but a backlog by definition is something that you do get through. So I think depending upon the discipline and how much the folks had to turn to that backlog, we may well see a dip coming up shortly. And in the most recent news and views, I was really interested to think about how OA publishers, both gold and hybrid OA publishers, are able to be nimble and kind of scale up in terms of their number of papers that they're publishing, and maybe do that a little bit more quickly than some of the subscription publishers might in terms of monetization, because they are locked into multi-year deals and they can't increase prices within a sort of narrow.
Or indeed, the thing, I think that's something we have explored in other pieces. There's a sort of the economics and mechanics of how the money flows in the open access model is different to subscriptions. And even if you're not locked into a multi-year subscription, subscriptions are paid for in advance. You buy the year ahead. So of course, if there's a massive spike in papers coming in from a subscription publishing point of view, that's essentially a lot more cost. You've still got to manage them and peer review them, but you can't put your prices up, exactly as you said, Heather. Whereas in a kind of pay to publish model, of course, the more stuff that comes in and the more you publish, then the more you charge. But of course, you're getting your money in arrears. So there's then it's got a different cash flow to all that. But I think absolutely that ability of open access to shift very quickly is a feature of the model and differentiates it from the subscription model. I also, just before we pushed on, wanted to pick up on one thing about sense checking the numbers. So, you've spoken to people, I've spoken to people. A couple of things just worth mentioning. As part of our sizing process, we reach out to publishers and we run a survey every year. And as a thank you so much to the publishers who have participated in that. And we'll be sending you your PowerPoint very, very soon. We're just polishing that off at the moment. Now, the point about our survey is it's confidential, so we do not share individual data points. But what it enables us to do is average the things up so that we can then get a sense of how the value and the volume is moving, and we can kind of get a view on what publishers are seeing. I found the interesting thing when sense checking the numbers was we can look at both data sources like on paywall and Crossref, which gives us the amount of stuff. We've got our publishers survey, which gives us their view on the amount of stuff and revenue. But then there's also reports that are put into the public domain. So some of the large corporate publishers, of course, will mention some of this stuff in their annual earnings reports. And some other publishers, not-for-profit publishers, for example, may well make these figures available anyway. And I think across the board, no matter what the source, we're seeing these big increases in numbers. I think I was struck by one large corporate who I think in their report said something like they'd seen a 0% increase in submissions going into their gold journals. So, I mean, sense checking the numbers, I think they do pass a sniff test, so to speak. And in actual fact, if you look at some of these reports, you might even think it's 25% small compared with some of the leaps that perhaps people have seen. I also wanted, just before we sort of move on, to mention one other thing that might be amplifying the growth in value, and that's currency effects. So it may well be that it's the effect of shifting exchange rates on top of increased submissions, and that can sort of multiply up how much more revenue comes in. It's actually very hard to unpick those. It's usually the very big corporates that have got the horsepower to actually do it, because effectively you have to run this year's accounts against last year's exchange rates to get a like-for-like comparison. It's not an easy thing to do, and it's certainly not something we have visibility into. But I thought it's just worth noting that in volatile times, there can be some of these kind of macroeconomic effects that drive things. And then I think, picking up on the backlog side of things, so, you know, Heather, as you pointed out, there is a spike going on here. The question is, how long will it last? And doffing my hat to your historian expertise, of course, we are still living through that piece of history. So we don't know how long this COVID spike will last. From a measuring the market point of view, it therefore means we don't have anything to measure. You know, we're kind of still in the middle of it. Usually these sizing exercises rely on us being able to take historical data and work on it. But if we're still seeing things happening in 2021, what we have to do as analysts is really form a hypothesis about what might be happening and how quickly or how long it might take before the COVID spike falls off. So what we've done is we've developed a hypothesis, which is basically that 2020 was very strong. 2021, we think people are seeing as quite a strong year, which could well mean it's a sort of average year, but from the highest starting point of 2020. But we know that people are going back to their labs. We know that vaccination programs are being rolled out. I know not everywhere in the world, but, you know, they're beginning to take root. So our hypothesis is that the COVID spike will be a spike. It will start to, or things will start to return to normal in 2022 as people go back to the labs. To your point, Heather, they start to work through that backlog and exhaust it. But more to the point, they'll start to go back to life as usual. And what that will mean for the numbers is, having had a spike, there will be a correction. There'll actually be a drop. So we're wondering if in 2022 we may see growth figures kind of lower, perhaps, than we have seen as things come back onto trend. Again, over to you, Heather. How does that sound? Does that sort of sound a defensible hypothesis?
Yeah, I mean, when I think about it, we may see a dip that actually goes further than what we normally would expect. I mean, there is research that didn't happen and experiments that didn't get started. So in addition to working through that backlog, there's going to be a gap before research that started as the vaccination campaigns and as the labs started to open up, as that started to kick off. One of the things that I'm really interested in seeing is how these read and publish agreements and transformative agreements with universities are going to change researcher behavior. We're just now starting to hear from publishers that their communications effort to their current authors at institutions where these agreements are in place, as well as the institutional side, communicating through the library or the Office of R&D or the like, you know, saying that these particular publishers have agreements in place. So while that's not going to have an effect on the overall number of research articles that might be submitted, it may well determine where they're being submitted, and we may see a higher than usual percentage of them going in the direction, you know, of these transformative agreements. So that's something that I'm looking at quite closely. There's a question that came in about, you know, this increase and how it might play out in terms of humanities, and I've been spending a lot of time working in the OA book space in the past year. And I think one of the interesting drivers there is the social justice movement and an increase in awareness amongst authors in anthropology, in sociology, that the populations that participate in their research and are visible there should have access to those publications, that we do see wider uptake both in the classroom and in terms of cited materials for content that is open and discoverable, which is obviously a key point there. So I do see an impact on open access, but maybe not for the same reasons that we're seeing it in the STEM fields.
Yeah. Now, actually, talking of questions, we've got a couple of them coming in. So in no particular order, does our survey do we survey subscribe to open publishers as to their OA revenues? I think the short answer is not as a separate segment. It's actually still a very, very small part of the market. However, duly noted, that might be something that is worth investigation as those models start to take root. And secondly, question about how much stuff, so how many articles are published to complement the numbers I mentioned on US dollars. So I'm just looking away here. We take a subset of the overall market, as I said. So if you look at kind of the complete cross-ref stroke on paywall data set, I think there's 3.5 or 3.6 million articles published in 2020. We are looking at approximately 2/3 of that, which we consider to be the kind of monetizable subset. So just to give you the context, and then the number we cited for that $975 million US dollars, we think that covers around about 1.2 million articles that are open access in that year of publication. So that's either open access in hybrid journals or open access in fully open access straight gold journals. So that's over 1.2 million articles. I hope that answers the question there. And then also one about, just to take us back a little bit, how will reduced subscription articles submitted manifest? So I think this is back to Heather, your point about what happens if there's a dip. And I think, I'll take a first stab at that. I mean, please do come in. Whether you're under a subscription model where you're seeing a big increase or a big decrease, it's sort of flip sides of the same problem. How do you deal with a situation where essentially you effectively want to fix your journal size, but you're certainly seeing a lot more or a lot less? I think it really will depend on the journal and the publisher as to whether you just publish bigger issues, which is much more possible in the electronic world, or whether you delay some articles, or whether you just publish slightly smaller issues. And I suspect there is a variation in journal size from one year to the next. I mean, Heather, I don't know if you've got any thoughts on.
I think as we move forward in time and we're used to online being the version of record, there's a less of a focus. I mean, I know from a researcher side, a less of a focus on how many issues or how many articles might be an issue. But of course, from the library side and subscriptions, if there's a dramatic reduction in the article output across that year, then certainly librarians are going to be taking note of that. So I'd be interested to hear from publishers on maybe some of the plans that they may have moving forward, what sort of contingencies they have in either of those cases.
And I suppose there's the other issue of cascade that one of the interesting things about increasing submissions, which is really the kind of primary output from the kind of COVID backlog, as it were, is just because there's more submissions doesn't necessarily mean they're all of the same quality as normal. And I think especially for publishers that maybe have a number of journals in their portfolio, if for whatever reason they feel they can't accommodate a particular submission in journal X, they could always move it on to journal Y. And I think we've quite often seen when publishers start to spin up open access journals, that could be a very valuable source of submissions to those open access journals in the early days, the so-called cascade effect as you move submissions between equivalent journals. So I would imagine the answer to that question is there will be a variety of approaches depending on the publisher, their portfolio, their approach.
It's
Um,
also interesting
I,
to think what the effect may be on some of the larger, preprint servers as well.
yeah, yeah, no, absolutely. One other question just before we push on. Somebody's asked the methodology question. Do we count only certain licenses towards open access? So basically, yes, we're looking at Creative Commons. It's got to be free to read and free to reuse with minimal restrictions. And subscribers to our tool can actually pull that apart. So we have analysis that break things out into more permissive and more restrictive open access licenses. So basically CC0, CC BY, more permissive. They tend to be the ones that the sort of big open access funders want to insist on. But there is a lot of open access publication under the more restrictive licenses, such as a non-derivative or non-commercial use. So we lump all of those together, but allow the users of our tool to break those out. And we also do some work with OASPA, the Open Access Scholarly Publishers Association. Every year on they gather some data, and again, we've had those conversations about that kind of split of open access license types. So I hope that answers the question there.
Yeah, and particularly for books, depending if your answer, if your question is directed more towards journals or for books, and as you might expect, there tend to be more of the restrictive OA licenses on the book side. That's something that we looked at over the summer, and we're keen to kind of do a little bit more of a kind of a direct comparison with the journal space as well.
So we've got another question about, can we speak to averages with APCs? So I can talk a bit to that. So APCs, article processing charges, we gather a lot of data on that, and you find typically around the start of the year, kind of late winter, early spring, we'll usually put out some analysis about that and hold a webinar on it. Briefly, in terms of sort of, if you like, the qualitative view, we've seen changes in APC pricing happen over the years. So as a general rule, the average price is getting slightly cheaper. So on average, if you take a median list price, it's lower now than it was perhaps 5 or 6 years ago. And that appears to be the case both for hybrid journals and for fully open access ones. However, as with all of these things, it's complicated. Because at the kind of mid to high end of the market, we're actually finding APCs are going up a bit. So what we're finding is if you plot a curve of what's the popular APCs, sort of a few years ago, it was quite a spike, and the curve's flattened out a bit and smoothed out a bit. So it seems that depending on the APC level, some authors might be paying a bit more, even though the average figure is somewhat less. And that can actually have effects, change kind of how much money ends up being paid. The other thing we do is we study list APCs to get a sense of pricing and what's typical and what's average. And forgive me, I don't have those numbers off the top of my head. I don't want to go rooting around in our website on the webinar. But I can say that hybrid tends to be typically more expensive than gold, fully open access. And then the other flip side of APCs is how much is actually paid. And what we find is what's actually paid per article. So you might term that as revenues per article, or kind of realized revenues per article. In our market, sizing is significantly less than the average list APCs. There are two major reasons for that. One is publishers will discount down from list. Discounting may be given to members of the society, or discounting may be locked in as part of a read and publish deal. And indeed, APCs can be discounted or waived for submissions coming from low-income countries. So in practice, what's charged is likely to be less than list. And secondly, when we're comparing list APCs with our average market revenues, they're somewhat different samples, because when we're looking at the whole market, we have to think about journals that are sponsored, so might not charge article processing charges at all, and quite a long tail of content that lies outside the core sample of publishers we survey for our kind of list prices. But essentially, our method relies on looking at our publishers survey, getting to some average revenues per article split down by a few categories, and then effectively scaling those up by the numbers of articles we see in the marketplace. And that's basically how we back into the overall market sizing without going into too methodological.
Yeah, just to kind of add to your points, Dan, I think that publishers having, good data about their particular, author behavior and within their discipline is incredibly useful to set those APCs, because you've probably heard us present before that while that average price is tending to get cheaper, in the longer tail, those prices in many cases are going up. So publishers are making data informed decisions about where to put those prices. We also need to consider the role that zero cost APCs play, because many times we kind of filter that out because it adds another kind of bump into the curve. But to get journals started or for sponsored content or the like, there in many cases are no cost APCs. And then just to the point on a waiver, because I'm getting a lot of questions from publishers thinking about their waiver policies. I've yet to find two publishers who do waivers in precisely the same way. And if you have a journal where there is invited content, for example, or content that just would not, for whatever reason, carry an APC, but due to a legacy systems fact, you may put that in as a waiver. So when you go back to look at your data, you can't tell the difference in reality between what truly was a zero APC and what was say invited content. So there's a lot of nuances to that, and we'd love to work with publishers to kind of understand that scenario a little bit better.
Yeah, I always joke that when you actually look at the specifics of business models, if you can think of it, someone's probably trying it. So we do see a lot of variations in how people actually put things into practice. I think that's also a symptom of change in marketplace. I mean, open access, yes, in some ways is 20 years young. If you go back to the Budapest Open Access Initiative in 2002, I think it was, but it is still a relatively new model when you think that publishing as a whole is several hundred years young, and scholarly publishing is 100 years. I can't remember when Oldenburg did the letters to the Royal Society. So when you draw up the timescales, I think we still are very much in a period of transition as people are experimenting with new models. One of the follow-ups, just asking about how we treat green and bronze open access. Yes, we do treat it. So basically, just to get some definitions down, I was careful to point out at the start that we are looking at capital O, capital A, open access, which we define to mean free to read and free to reuse. So that's sort of our definition of open access. There is a sort of second way of defining open access, which is free to read, but maybe not free to reuse, or free to read, whatever. It doesn't really speak about the license. So something that is free to read but not to reuse, we would describe as public access, but that is also known as bronze open access as well in many circles. So our data does look at that. And again, if you come into our tool, subscribers of our tool can actually break things out by proportions of articles that are open access in gold journals, open access in hybrid, bronze / public access, and also subscription access. So we have all of that data. In terms of market sizing, public access is not necessarily paid for via an APC or equivalent route in the same way that a capital O, capital A open access article might be. So we don't break bronze out in terms of market sizing because our view is actually usually part of another model. And similarly with green, green is quite hard to get to because in actual fact, whilst an article is under embargo, it's probably part of a subscription or the subscription part of a hybrid journal. There's not a kind of green bucket necessarily. And then once it is put outside the paywall, it comes off embargo, then it simply flips to the open access bit of what essentially is a hybrid journal. So again, it's quite difficult to quantify that We've got some data on it, but we tend not to pull that apart for sizing, again, because no money's changing hands directly. But it is something we're thinking about, and it gets us onto something that like Heather and I and the other folks at Delta will be talking about, looking into next year. We know that green is becoming a part of the landscape. There's conversations about zero embargo green, particularly coming from the kind of coalition S side of things. And that also gets us into rights retention discussions as a sort of whole big cluster of topics there. So it's something we do want to dig into. We're still really thinking about the best method to do that. But certainly the effects of these sorts of things, I think, could be profound, could not. We just don't know. Therefore, they're worth studying. And that's something you'll be hearing from us more about, I think, going into 2022. And we do anticipate reaching out to publishers, because that may be something we need to figure out how we gather some data on to see what people's views are about that. So I hope that's just covered off the green and bronze and the implications on that. So I think we worked through most of the questions. I see there's a couple more, but I thought it might just be useful to take a step back a bit at this point and remind ourselves that we have been talking about the COVID spike. So lots more submissions driving an increase in revenue, and then our hypothesis that things will return to normal through 2022, with perhaps a sort of a corresponding dip in things. But this also gets us then into saying, well, if we're talking about falling back to normal, actually what is normal and what are underlying trends? And at the moment, it's too soon to tell if COVID will move the whole trend up and down the chart, as it were. So our hypothesis is for the moment that it's a spike, and as the more data comes in, we'll change that. But I thought it's worth speaking briefly about some of the underlying trends, because they do speak to shifting patterns in the marketplace. So just very briefly, when we do our analysis every year, if you basically plot a chart of how much stuff is published under whatever model, it really doesn't matter, how much stuff is published vertically over time, you tend to get a fairly smooth line. But in actual fact, when people are planning budgets, taking decisions about resourcing, as anybody who sat in a board meeting or looked at P&L will tell you, it's usually the growth, the year-over-year change, that's actually a very important number as well. So you often see in accounts or budgets this year and last year, you see pairs of numbers. So what we do for our analysis is we take the smooth chart, looking at the number of stuff, amount of stuff, and we calculate the annual change each year. And when you plot that on a chart, you tend to, I'm going to use a very technical statistical term now, when you plot the year-over-year change on a chart, it gets very zigzaggedy. You tend to see 1 year a big growth or a big change, the next year quite a low one, the following year a big one, and so on. And historically we've seen that, but the zigs and zags have obviously been moving around a very clear underlying trend. So our method has been to look at the underlying trend, because we felt that it would be a bit of a kind of clickbaity, misleading headline to say, gee, growth in, I don't know, hybrid output has collapsed because the growth number is a lot less this year than it was last year, or, growth in open access has exploded because of vice versa, when we know the next year things could be changed. So we think focusing on the underlying trend gives us the best strategic read on the direction of the market. The trouble then comes, of course, when a genuine zig or zag happens. We've had to take a view that, yeah, we can't just keep going with the smooth chart. COVID is a genuine zig or zag that we've got to put in. But that when we do think about the long term, at the moment, our thesis is that COVID won't shift those underlying trends significantly, and that come 2023, we should see things fall back to the smooth curve. I keep waving my hand at you, to the smooth curve, the underlying trend. And so when we think about what shifts might be happening, we want to focus on those underlying trends. We think that might give us the sort of the best read on what might be happening based on what we know today. Of course, if in a couple of years' time the data tells a different story, we'll need to update our calculations. And when you look at the underlying trends, even allowing for data, basically dialing out the COVID spike, even then open access really is driving the marketplace. in two, I think, quite interesting ways. One is it's now beginning to cannibalize subscription content. So open access output is growing a lot faster than the overall market. The overall market output is growing about, let's say, 5-6% a year. Open access output is we think long term will be growing at 15% a year, and in the short term has been growing much faster than that. So of course, what you've got is the open access line is a lot steeper than the overall growth line, and that means the kind of bit that's left is going to start shrinking. So we think that come 2024, we are going to see somewhat of a tipping point in the sort of growth dynamics, and we're effectively going to see that the share of non-open access articles, subscription articles, is going to start to reduce because open access has got big enough, is already more than a third, it's going to keep growing, it's eventually going to start to eat in to that subscription output. And so that means, we think it could well be in 2 or 3 years' time, the volume of subscription output is going to start to shrink slightly each year, whilst open access carries on growing. And in terms of revenue, we think what that means is the revenue growth. So at the moment, the revenues from subscription access are growing each year, and from open access are growing each year, and both are growing more each year. But we think what's like to happen is come about 2023, 2024, the growth in subscription access will start to slow. So there'll be less growth kind of in 2025 than there was in 2024, and the chart will kind of go over a hump. And again, this is because open access is just beginning to displace things and take over. So we think there's some quite interesting dynamics in the long-term trends. And one other final thing before we go on to why that might be happening is that open access is now driving the growth in the overall revenue of journal publishing in total. So we think easily half the growth in journal publishing revenue can be attributed solely to the growth in open access revenue. So although open access accounts for less than a tenth of total revenue, is growing so quickly that it is actually moving the needle on the revenue growth as a whole. And we think those figures of the half of total growth seem to bear scrutiny and bear sense checks. So we've got this interesting dynamic of open access now really beginning to effectively start to take over more and more and more, as it's got both sort of big enough and is growing quickly enough to start to move the needle, as it were. And then I think it's interesting, Heather, to dig into a little bit as to why that might be happening and what might be driving it, and indeed what might cause our numbers to be wrong, because of course they are just trends that we pulled out from a chart. So I don't know if you have any thoughts on that.
Yeah, I mean, certain things we can look at and say they're not going to change dramatically. There's not going to all of a sudden be significantly more researchers, in the world. We can look at money that's being budgeted, by funders and by countries and regions, and we can see the directions, that's going in. So I'm also really interested in the timelines there that you cited, looking at the end of 2024, because I've been participating in lots of conversations lately about Plan S, and with that end of 2024, date looming out there for transformative journals, publishers may not be at that, magic 70% point, but if they're passing 50, then that may well have a big impact on the timelines for certain decisions that they're making. I'm also wondering, from a researcher standpoint too, you get burned once on a proposal, you may put in your next grant proposal and try to design it to be a little bit more COVID proof. So maybe undertaking, research that can be conducted remotely, or can be conducted in smaller groups or off hours, where lab closure or lab capacity reduction, isn't going to have as much of an impact. So I'm curious to see if we might see, changes in some of the overall proposals by discipline that come from the funder side of things. So kind of a fascinating time to be taking a look at.
And I think there's a sort of variety of push and pull things. So yeah, I've cited some numbers as based on trending out charts. So we always have to think, well, that's kind of an arithmetic view. It's not the real world. It's a model. And I think Plan S is an interesting example because, yes, we've got things that are pushing things forward. I think undoubtedly Plan S has sort of reinvigorated conversations about open access. And on the back of that, we know publishers large and small are looking at how they engage with it. But an interesting thing about Plan S is it is effectively geographically constrained. It is about one geography's group of funders looking to move things. Most publishers will say, well, of course, they have to deal with the entire globe. And if you look at regions, say, like the US, which currently, as far as we know, seems to be favouring a public access policy, not necessarily a flipped up, fully open journals. Or we could look at China, which I think is, my view, kind of lukewarm on open access. I think at the APE conference a few years ago, there were some people from one of the big Chinese funders saying, yes, we support it in principle, but in practice, in actual fact, we know that some entirely reputable, fully open journals have been blacklisted, and there is still a sort of view in China that perhaps open access doesn't represent best quality. And there is also a focus in China of an encouraging of local Chinese publications in favor of international ones. So all of those things suggest that, of course, open access might plateau. It may well be, once the effects of Plan S have washed through and everybody covered by those grants is done, we may then find the kind of growth figures of open access start to level off fairly abruptly. Mm-hmm. That change what happens to our long-term trends. It may actually act as an inhibitor. Meanwhile, of course, there could still be a driver of open access. So California Digital Library, for example, its renegotiation, the rise of things like unsub, and I think librarians now beginning to review in the round their subscriptions. We mentioned rights retention and zero embargo green. But those things perhaps could lead to people cancelling subscriptions. At which point, of course, then almost by default, that will favour alternative models and will favour open access. So there's kind of a whole bunch of ideas I think we could throw into the ring.
Yeah, and I think also we can't forget how discipline specific, or even sub-discipline specific a lot of this stuff is. And, the publishers have, great data around OA, attitudes of their authors, across the field. And, looking at that data, I remember the AAAS announcement over the summer that they're going to, stay, all in with their subscription side of things. And so it may well be that there's just not the underlying driving force to get that OA percentage over a certain point. And also, I mean, when you're talking to publishers and they're relying primarily on subscription revenue, getting involved in the transformative journal space can be a risk, because if you jump in, then you lose maybe some of your negotiating power with the institutions you've traditionally relied upon. So definitely a balancing act.
Absolutely. And actually, just to clarify on the trends, we had a question coming in. So in terms of open access cannibalizing subscriptions, there's two things at play. Yes, open access is growing much faster. Open access output is growing much faster than subscriptions. The inflection point, however, in roughly 2024 is, if you follow the lines on the charts, we think by 2024, open access will account for more than half, 50% of total output. So at that point, subscriptions, which have to date been the majority of output, will move to the minority, and open access will start to take over. So we'll see that flipping across. I hope that answers that question there. There's then another question on what was the increase in subscription output in 2020? I actually just need to consult a chart off screen here. So we think that's about a 5% increase in 2020 over 2019. And that's a good question in the sense this COVID spike has affected everything. There's just been more articles published across the board. Every business model has seen a spike. It so happens we think the spike in the open access growth is a kind of taller spike than the spike in subscription growth, but both have absolutely been growing. So I hope that addresses that question. I'm then thinking, we've been through some headline output. We've talked about the COVID spike, our hypothesis that it's temporary, and then we've got into some exploration of kind of long-term trends and how we might be starting to see a shift. But of course, we've caveated that. We know there's a number of factors at play. I'm thinking, are there any other questions people want to chip in? Heather, do you have any?
Yeah, there's a couple questions. That one that came in via email, and I see a similar question in the chat or in the Q&A around the analysis between APC and impact factors. I mean, I can kick off with an answer to that one. We do a lot of work with data on SNP, which some of you may have maybe have heard of, but maybe some of you are less familiar. Source normalized impact per paper, which enables you to compare perceived impact by average number of citations across different subject areas. So it's a really interesting lens to view. For folks who joined a couple weeks ago, I did a demo from the OA DAT and actually showed some examples within that webinar, and there's a recording up on our website. If you want to go take a look, you can see, what give you more bang for your buck in terms of APCs, both in the gold space and in the hybrid space. I know that you spend a lot of time looking at the underlying data around those charts. Dan, you want to fill in with anything?
Yeah, I mean, essentially, we don't think there's a very strong relationship between the SNP, the source normalizing per paper, and the list price being asked. We haven't done an in-depth study with journal impact factors. I'd love to do that. I suspect there might be a slightly stronger correlation, but in general, authors don't shop around. So really the biggest predictor of how much you're likely to pay as an APC is going to be whether it's hybrid or not. Then there's also disciplines. So different disciplines will charge different amounts. But as a general rule, yes, we have seen quite high APCs asked for journals that have a relatively low citation-based impact, and vice versa. So as Heather said, there's lots of data in the tool itself for our subscribers. We do occasionally put pieces out on this, but so yes, we've done the work, and the relationship is actually fairly weak to non-existent so far as we can tell. But again, that's something we continue to look into. It's a never-ending source of fascination.
Yeah, and if you want to find out more about that, just ping me. I'm happy to demo, that portion of the tool for you. Let's see, we've got a question on taxonomy. Disciplines.
So the SNP is actually derived from Scopus data. It's actually produced by CWTS, who are affiliated with the University of Leiden. They do the number crunching to calculate that. And the subject taxonomy they use, and therefore we use for all this, is the ASGJC. I think the all science journal codes are all subject journal codes. So that's basically the taxonomy that Scopus and some of these measures use. It gives about 320 odd divisions grouped in about sort of 18 or so the broader division. So you'll get health medicine, health nursing, and so on, and under health you'll get health medicine oncology or health nursing oncology and so on. So it's quite a rich vocabulary. In theory, we could do it by other taxonomies, just the way our tools are set up. So again, as Heather says, do please reach out if you're interested in looking at other ways of dicing and slicing that information.
Great. Last call for questions. If you've got something that's burning urgent. If not, let's any surprises, last minute surprise, any surprises for more significant growth year over year in any field or country than you anticipated? We're still digging into it. I'll start the new data. Dan, we lock Dan up in a room for the couple months it takes these surveys to come in so that he can, devote a lot of attention to it. So, I will say, we're really looking forward to digging more in the data, but anything that struck you throughout this experience, Dan?
I think the short answer is I don't think so. We'd had the benefit of kind of being pre-warned. So when we were doing this webinar and our sizing update this time last year, I remember we talked about the notion, because at that time we'd heard anecdotally from publishers that there was lots of submissions coming in, and I suspect to many on the call, the big leap in submissions is not news, it's not breaking news. It's something that we've been aware of for a while. It effectively works across the board. You saw particular spikes in areas of medicine and life sciences, which you kind of expect in the wake of COVID. So I don't think there was anything that's particularly standing out. Probably more, there's a counter trend I'm noticing kind of buried in the data, which again was sort of happening anyway. I'm not sure it's directly related to COVID, but 2 or 3 years ago, the open access output was really being driven by the big mega journals like PLOS One and Scientific Reports. They were really in the ascendancy. In the last 2 or 3 years, the volumes of output from, I think, both of those have started to tail off, which seems to be related to the way impact factors were working out and all sorts of things. So in some ways, maybe some sort of intense areas of output have spread out a little bit, or move between different journals, and that might technically knock things from a purely multidisciplinary journal to a general medicine journal or a general life science journal or something. So there might be some shuffling around within subject areas that way. But that we're getting into, I think, to quite a deep nuance there. So the short answer is no. On the whole, no major surprises given what we were already hearing about was happening anyway.
Great. Well, I think we're going to wrap up for today. Thanks everyone who submitted a question, and for if we missed any questions, don't hesitate to reach out. And so let me just put up our closing slide, which has email addresses for me and for Dan, in case you need to get a hold of us. So many thanks to Dan and everyone on the Delta Think team that made this most recent News and Views and webinar possible, including our survey participants. We would be hard pressed to do this without your assistance. Thanks to everyone for a great session. We will be sharing a recording out both by email and on our website within a couple of days. So if you can't help but to watch it again, or you want to send it to all your friends, that will be possible. And if there's anything we didn't quite get to, we're happy to have a one-on-one exchange. Our next discussion forum will likely be in early 2022, topic to be announced. Lori Carlin, Meg White, and I will be at the Charleston conference in 2 weeks. So look for us there. You'll be able to spot me with the rainbow hair. And Dan and Anne will be presenting at Contech November 16th and 17th for folks who are over in the UK or who might want to travel. So thanks, everyone. Have a wonderful day and take care.